Well, I'm glad that Sam introduced Elliot because he hadn't. I was going to do that. Yesterday, when Elliot went with us at Fort Barrington, and I remarked that in 1996, when I joined the Bartram Patrol Conference, I did so by sending a check to Elliot Edwards in Savannah, Georgia. He was the president, the vice president, the treasurer, and the secretary. I assume. This may seem a little disjointed because I'm going to concentrate on Bartram and what I call the trans-Altamaha, between the Altamaha River and the St. Mary's River. Although he did travel in north of Darien, that's not as interesting because it's well settled and he didn't write that much about it. Another thing is he got to, right off the bat in chapter 1, he got things out of order. And a lot of what, some of what he wrote about didn't happen when it did happen later. So we're going to start with 1773. Plus I've got a note here. Like I say, it's still seem a little disjointed because these notes were coming and going in different orders. It's fitting that we have the Bartram Patrol Conference finally in Darien, Georgia, because for the almost 4 years that William Bartram was in the South, he spent 18 months in Darien. That's a year and a half. And the infuriating thing about William Bartram is that he didn't write about a lot of that time. And so some of what we know, we had to pick up from letters and other documents, not from travels. If anybody who's familiar with William Bartram knows that he wrote letters to Dr. Fothergill in London. And of course, he wasn't real fastidious about that. He would send a bunch of stuff at one time, maybe a year later. So we have to put his letters to Fothergill together with the travels to figure out what he did and when he did it. But he arrived in Darien in late April 1773. And of course, it didn't look like this then. Darien was entering into a little bit of an economic boom after a decline in the 1740s and 50s. There had been some disruption with Oglethorpe's wars with Florida. But with the rice plantations that were beginning to be built in the Altamaha River, there was some new prosperity. And the town was laid out again, like when McIntosh did the survey and laid out the streets in 1767. And so while you're in Darien, there are just a few things I want to talk about. Of course, those who are staying down the street can look out the window and see the shrimp boats. Go down to the river, and they've got a river walk that's not too old. It's maybe about 10 years ago or something like that. And the old tabby ruins from the warehouses are still in existence. And be sure to, if you have time, go to Fort King George, which is a state historic site, and a lot of the ramparts and blockhouse have been rebuilt. But the site is an old Spanish mission. It was an Indian village. It was a British fort, and then it was a turpentine, steel, and sawmill. So it's the industrial heart of Darien. Bartram wrote that right after he got to Darien, he went to the St. Mary's River. But he did. He went to Brunswick, and he went to the St. Mary's River later in 1776. So that's where we're going to talk about that. Oops. When he came to Darien, he immediately went and met Lycan McIntosh, who, is there a pointer on this?
Yes.
Oh, I see it. Okay. General's Island. US 17 crosses General's Island. When you leave Darien, you cross the Darien River, and immediately on General's Island. That was like the McIntosh's main plantation, and his home was there. He also owned land up on Cathead Creek, but I haven't been able to find much about that. And so for much of the time that William Bartram was in Darien, he probably stayed on this island somewhere with the likely McIntosh family. And of course, oh, let's go back. You can see the rice fields are still visible. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service still maintains them so that they can flood them. Well, a lot of them, so they can flood them for waterfowl. And a good place to see that is, it's not over here, but you'll see it later. Champney Island, those people who are going on the boat ride on Sunday, when you go down US 17, you turn left into the parking lot, you can turn right and go into the old rice fields. You can see an old rice trunk, and there's an observation deck where you can look at the birds in the water. Even though this is from Harper's Magazine, 1867, rice culture didn't change that much from when Bartram visited Lakeland McIntosh at this rice plantation. And you can see, of course, a lot of handwork done by enslaved Africans. And Beth Thompson had a question yesterday about Bartram and slavery, and that's something I've been dealing with for the past year and reading as much as I can online about it. And that he wrote a lot about the Creeks and the Cherokees and the Seminoles, and he was completely surrounded by slaves the whole time he was here. And during the time of the travels, he didn't say anything about it. And there may be some reason for that, for the same reason why he didn't mention the Revolution, which was all around him. And he may have had a motive for not doing that, I don't know. But he did become actively and positively anti-slavery, anti-slave owning later in his life. Okay, so he did go to the St. Mary's River, but he did go to Brunswick. And to do that, you go up to Fort Barrington and cross over, because otherwise you have to ferry across numerous rivers to get to the other side. Brunswick was surveyed in 1771. The land between the Altamaha River and the St. Mary's River was called neutral land. In the 1740s, the British and the Spanish agreed that neither one of them would claim that land. So between those two rivers, it was vacant, except for gangs of unsavory kinds of people who wanted to live outside the law. But in 1763, in the French and Indian War, it became British territory, and then British citizens could start getting land grants there. And the first land grants were given by South Carolina because they claimed this. And the Board of Trade said, no, you can't do that, it belongs to Georgia. And Georgia, it became part of Georgia. You can see that, so he crossed over Fort Barrington and probably came down this way in the city to visit one of Henry Lawrence plantations on the coast. And we'll have an aerial view of that in just a minute. But at Fort Barrington, this is a map by DeBron, who was the Surveyor General of Georgia. And you can see he's got the road to Darien, the road to Savannah. It crosses the river just south of Fort Barrington. You didn't cross at Fort Barrington at that time. And then it becomes the road to Augustine. And we'll look at the road to Augustine later. But here's an aerial view, Google Maps today, and you can see the road to Darien, the road to Savannah, and indeed, over here, there is a road to St. Augustine in these woods. And I've been on it, and it's kind of hard to navigate because it gets flooded a lot of the time. And of course, Fort Barrington. He said that he got to the coast and visited one of Henry Lawrence plantations. At that time, Henry Lawrence owned Broughton Island. The McIntosh family owned Broadface Plantation, And Henry Lawrence owned New Hope Plantation. And I think that it's New Hope Plantation that he visited because it said Henry Lawrence Plantation. Broadface Plantation is now Hopple Broadfield Plantation State Historic Site. It ceased being a rice operation in the early 1900s and became a dairy operation. But it is a fun place to go to visit. And then he visited Brunswick, which had only recently been laid out, didn't have very many citizens living in it. Most of the lots were being purchased by wealthy landowners who owned land in Sunbury, in Midway, and Savannah. Many of them were loyalists and fled the colony during the Revolution. So Brunswick had to be rebuilt again after the Revolution. In 1774, he made an excursion to Florida. After traveling in northeast Georgia, he returned to Darien in July of 1773 and remained there until he left from Florida in March of 1774. He was ill for 2 months after sending his baggage on to Florida, which means that he was incapacitated for August and September of 1773. And I haven't been able to verify this, but somewhere one time I read that rather than living with the McIntosh family, he rented a house in Darien to recuperate. I have to find that again. After he got well, he hung around the area for a while and probably visited some people he knew. And it may have been then that he went to Sapelo Island. He wrote that he sailed up the Altamaha River and saw a lunar eclipse, but that was in 1776 also, so that's out of place. But he wrote to his father on March 27, 1775. You'll see how in his letters he's talking about things that have passed a year before. I put my baggage on board a vessel bound from Savannah to Mr. Spalding's store on St. John's, intending to go by land there, and set off accordingly to get safe to the Altamaha, where I was taken ill with a fever, which I did not recover so as to be able to travel for near 2 months. When I set off again, but was turned back again by express from East Florida, that the Indians were up in arms against us in that province, and all the Indian stores except one were robbed and broken up. So I stayed in the southern parts of Georgia waiting for a favorable turn. And here I discovered and collected many valuable and new vegetables. Hearing that lower creeks were treating with the governor of St. Augustine for peace, I resolved to make the second attempt. I left my horse in Georgia and went down the Altamaha to Frederica and the island of St. Simon's, waiting on Mr. Spalding. In here, I've always been curious about this first attempt to reach Florida. The second attempt, he said he left his house, of course, in Georgia, but he didn't say that about the first attempt. So it could have been that he started out overland, but we have no idea how far he got. His trip to Florida, he stayed in what's now the Intracoastal Passageway. So we can claim that as the Bartram Trail. And he got off at St. Simon's and visited James Spalding. And this is the remnants of the house that he lived in. I don't think he built it because there were still some houses standing at the time. But he and his wife had just had a baby son who was named Thomas, who grew up to be a famous Georgian, owned most of Sapelo Island. If you go to Frederica, you're going to have to walk around and keep reading all the signs to find it, because there's not really a map telling you where everything is. But the National Park Service says this is James Spalding's house. From there, he went to the southern part of St. Simon's Island. And it's a really nice part of the book because he talks about how beautiful St. Simon's was. The main road at the time was what's called the Military Road. It's left over from the days of Oglethorpe, and it goes right by the Bloody Marsh battle site. Bartram didn't say anything about it, but on St. Simon's Island, it's a nice place to go and spend the morning because it's really beautiful, and you're right next to salt marsh, and you can just walk out in it. he left St. Simon's Island, went on down. The boat he was on was going to turn back because they got news that things weren't all right in Florida. But he was determined to go on, so they had to put him off at Cumberland Island. He walked to the southern part of the island where the old fort was, and then crossed over to Amelia Island. And the old fort was near the Dungeness ruins. But what I've read is that the site has since washed away. So it may have been just down a little bit below what's called the ice house. But it was in this vicinity. After he returned from West Florida in January 1776, he made his way back to Darien, and he stayed in the area until late October or late November, I can't remember. And again, the infuriating thing about William Bartram is he spent almost a year in Darien in 1776. There was a lot going on, and he didn't say nothing about it. He wrote, after my return from the Creek Nation, I employed myself during the spring and forepart of summer in revisiting the several districts in Georgia and the east borders of Florida, where I had noted the most curious subjects, collecting them together and shipping them off to England. In the course of these excursions and researches, I had the opportunity of observing the new flowering shrub resembling the Gordonia. So this is when he saw Franklinia in bloom, was in June or July of 1776. And at my house, my Franklinias bloom in late July. And they bloom in early July down here, but I'm not sure. So that's when he finally got to see it. This is also when he traveled to the St. Mary's River. This is when he encountered the Seminole, who he thought was going to take his life. But again, you had to cross at Fort Barrington. And he came down this way, and we're going to look at that in detail, but he wrote, after crossing Fort Barrington, I followed the high road to the ferry on the St. Ill, which is the Satilla, about 60 miles south of the Altamaha, passing through an uninhabited wilderness. The sudden transition from rich cultivated settlements to high pine forests, dark and grassy savannas, forms, in my opinion, no disagreeable contrast. This area had just been open for settlement in 1763, 1765. And of course, unlike Northeast Georgia, where small farmers were taking up small land grants, the British government and Governor Wright gave large land grants in this area because they figured those were the people with the means and the money to establish rice plantations. So there was settlement along the coast. And there's a geological phenomenon called the ancient barrier islands. And they've been mapped. This is the one that we're looking at right here today, is the Talbot Islands. Just west of that is the Penholloway Islands. And then there's Trail Ridge, which the reason why the Okefenokee is there is because Trail Ridge makes it so. So that's why we don't want people messing with Trail Ridge. But the Talbot Islands, the reason why the road to St. Augustine came this way is the land is fairly flat, and then it suddenly rises at the Talbot Islands, and it's deep sand. And it's good for pine trees and longleaf wiregrass. It's not good for farming or cultivation, no rice. And but it was good for cattle range. And that's what mostly was going on in the western part of this new area. You'll notice that the Indian line was just past this ridge, and it went down to what we now call Trader's Hill. So if anybody was doing anything over here, they were doing it illegally, which didn't mean they weren't going to be doing it. Especially the people with cattle range, if they could get away with it, they would do it. But Bartram talks about a cow pen. And you'll see right here, this is Turtle River at Brunswick, and its headwaters come up right to this sand ridge. That's where the cow pen existed. We think that we're pretty sure that it's Kearney's cow pen that William Bartram spent the night at. Kearney's cow pen shows up on maps for the next 20 or 30 years, even though Kearney was long gone. I'm just going to read what I do know about Kearney because I'll forget something. It was most likely the property of Arthur Kearney, or Kearney, who also owned property in Sunbury and present-day Glenn and Camden counties. Again, he was wealthy, a large landowner, so therefore they gave him even more land and even more wealth. He was born in North Carolina in 1732 and was involved in the Indian trade when a young man. He moved to Georgia about 1762. Because of his conversion to the Loyalist cause, Kearney's property was confiscated and sold at auction after the Revolution, and he died in 1783. The dearest location that we can identify, or that's a human settlement, is Waynesville, which is on this old road. So this is called the Old Post Road, and it continues on down here. You can follow it. And down here, it kind of gets hard to follow because it's all pine plantations owned by timber companies, and they block off some of it. But the road is still there. This is a map of the area between the Altamaha River and the St. Mary's River that was drawn about in the 1780s. And you can see this road that William Bartram followed. But he crossed over right here at Mills Ferry. This map shows the road crossing over what is called Camp Pinckney. That was the old King's Highway. It wasn't completed in this area until 1773. So in 1765, when William Bartram came this way with his father, they would have come this way to Mills Ferry, which is now called King's Ferry. And William Bartram had a tendency to want, he knew that road already. That's the way he was going to go, not the new route. And at Mills Ferry, there was an Indian store, and 1 mile away was Fort Tannen, which was built later in 1776, about the time Bartram left the state. So there's Bartram's route to the St. Mary's River. And of course, it did look like an uninhabited wilderness because he was just riding through longleaf pine and wiregrass forests. There were no settlements, maybe some stray cows or something like that. Right in here, between the Satilla and the St. Mary's River, is where he encountered the Seminole. And I've identified all the places on this map, just so I know what's going on, because it's hard to read. But on that old road, which is now modern roads, in the distance, to the right is the town of Waynesville. To the left is it's called the Golden Isles Racetrack. They have stock car races there. And it's kind of funny because this whole area would have been cow pen. The cow pens were run by cowboys. And the cows were everywhere. And sometimes they would bring them into a central area where they could corral them and they could brand them. And the cowboys were, of course, a few men living in the woods, taking care of the cows. And this is a place where you can stand in the middle of the road and say, William Bartram rode his horse down this road. This is just south of Waynesville, and it's fun to go out here, even though it's owned by timber companies. there's always a lot of stuff in the ditches. That's the fun place to do is get in the ditches beside the road because that's where the flowers are. And if it's a paved road, then that means the county mows it, which is does the same thing as fire. It keeps trees and large shrubs out, so you get to do some nice botanizing. And the Georgia Botanical Society always does a roadside botanizing excursion in July, on the hottest day of the year, in South Georgia, around this area between the Satilla River and the Okefenokee Swamp. It's a lot of fun to go to. Then the road kind of, it doesn't disappear, but it's inaccessible to public traffic. I started to drive up in here one day and decided better because somebody may come along and close the gate behind me, and then I could be in real trouble. As far as I know, Camden Reserve, which looks like it's supposed to be houses, it's nothing but pine trees right now. Then, after crossing the Satilla River at a place called Old Jefferson, you follow Summer Hill Road. And from looking at the old maps, it looks to me like this is indeed real close to the old road that William Archer would have taken to what we now call King's Ferry. In the late 1970s, Camden County marked the Bartram Trail from the top of the county to the St. Mary's River. And in the 1990s, there were 2 signs still in existence, and now there's only 1. And I've told Elizabeth King about this. She's president of the St. Mary's Garden Club, so she can help keep an eye on it. So far, the road scrapers haven't knocked it over, but this is where Summer Hill Road meets Georgia 40. And it's a remnant of the early days of the Bartram Trail Conference. And oddly enough, there's a sign just like this on the old Federal Road in Alabama, the fort whose name escapes me right now. Huh? No,
Decatur?
farther up. It's named after one of the heroes of Alabama. Fort anyway, I'll think of it when I sit down. But this road is a lot of fun to drive on because it's a dirt road. And he crossed the St. Mary's River after his getting a heart attack from the Seminole Indian spying him. And it was called Mills Ferry. And I think at the time, the family that ran it was the Mills. Then it became, the King family purchased it. And at one time it became a real town with a sawmill and all of that. But the reason why the ferry is here is because you'll notice, if you've ever been on the St. Mary's River, this is a narrow place. So you can swim your horse over and it would be easy to put a ferry and put the ropes up. There's a map that I discovered in the Library of Congress. This is the map of the coast of Georgia bordering on Camden and Glenn counties, showing also the course and sounding of the Altamaha, Turtle, Crooked, St. Mary's, Great Satilla, and Little Satilla rivers. And I just pulled out this one part of it because you see there's Mills Ferry. Here's the road. Fort Tynan destroyed. Fort Tynan only lasted a few months or 6 months. Down here is Temple, a person named Temple owned that land. And at the top, it says Wright's Bluff. And I'm 90% sure that that's either German or Charles Wright, brothers of Governor Wright. There's a possibility it could be another Wright. But the things I can read about who owned what where were really vague. And I don't even think the people who owned the land knew exactly where their boundaries of the land were. If you've got 20,000 acres, it didn't matter to you where the boundary was. But this, I think, was one of the upper plantations of the Wright brothers. I pulled this out because the shows where Bartram crossed over, but also today, when Diane and I are in St. Mary's, we like to take the kayaks up to Temple Landing. We kayak up to Mills Ferry, which is about 2 miles, Kings Ferry. And then, of course, the Sotelo of it, St. Mary's River being what it is, we can paddle upriver and paddle back down to our car. We don't have to have a shuttle. That's why we don't kayak in Athens, Georgia, because you got to get somebody to go down the river and bring it back. Then, of course, he did not sail on the Omaha River in 1773. The eclipse was July the 31st, 1776. We know that's when. So he was traveling around this part of Georgia a lot in 1776, and he doesn't tell us about it. This is San Sevilla Bluff. John and William Bartram explored this bluff when they crossed the river in 1765. Before that, there was Mary Musgrove's. She had a store there. She was the interpreter for James Edward Oglethorpe, and she was quite a character. She claimed the state of Georgia owed her money for service to Oglethorpe, so they gave her Ossabaw Island, I think it was. So she owned it at one time. And then there was at one time there was a fort here in the colonial times, but it didn't last very long. I think about the time it was built, the Indians attacked it and they moved across the river. Then it became a town called Mount Pleasant, a little timber town for a short period of time. But because this is part of that Talbot Islands, it's a very high sand bluff, and it's one of the prettiest places on the Omaha River. And this is how you get to it, unless you have four-wheel drive. We were afraid to drive any farther. And then in the San Sevilla Wildlife Management Area, dry sand is more dangerous than wet sand. So if it was dry that day, we did not want to get stuck, so we walked to the bluff to get a view of the river, and it's really beautiful there. So that's William Bartram's travels in what I call the Trans-Altamaha region. But thank you very much.